All right, the book of Kings, chapter 2, meaning second installment. All right, so we have done last week, we have studied, especially we have focused on Solomon, the first 11 chapters. And how did Solomon do at the end? Not too well. Okay, good. Stuff that we may not hear in Sunday school when we grow up, but he actually finished pretty badly. He's not even listed in Hebrews chapter 11 with the man of faith. So we don't even know whether he is saved or not, whether he's in heaven or not. Looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, if Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, which we don't know, but if he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, then I would say he's in heaven. But we don't know whether he is the one who wrote it. So that remains an open question. But anyway, we do know that in the time of Solomon, he had immense wealth, and he was like economically like a powerhouse. He controlled the trade routes. We talked about the important trade route that the land of Palestine actually provided for the different civilizations. So he had dominion over kings in that area. So he was like people were paying tribute to King Solomon. He had a very promising start. God himself said to Solomon, "You will be a great empire, and your dynasty, you will have a continual dynasty forever. There will be a throne, a son on the throne forever, as long as you obey me," God says. Okay, that was of course the big iffy. All right, so continue victory over enemy, to have peace in the land, and have prosperity. That was promised. But as we know, it didn't go very well with Solomon at the end. Okay, because at the moment when everything was going for him, when Israel has reached its climax, both politically and spiritually, remember they built the temple and God's Spirit came down into the temple, filled the temple, so spiritually was a climax too, a spiritual height and also a political height, and right after that, Solomon messed up and sins greatly and brought idolatry into the nation. All right, and God said, "I'm now going to punish you and I'm going to divide the kingdom. But I'm not going to do it in your lifetime for your father's sake, David. But it will be happening with your son." And so that is what we're going to read about, talk about this week. All right, let's see. So here we are. If I can get my PowerPoint to work. All right. So, yeah, all right. So here we see chapter 12. We go from a united kingdom to a divided kingdom. 1Kings chapter 12 onwards, yeah? And you have that also on the big picture overview. Right at chapter 12, you see that the kingdom is divided. And then, so we then have two kingdoms henceforth. And so then, and here it gets confusing, so pay attention. Beginning in chapter 12, when we begin talking about Israel, we actually are talking about the northern tribes, the northern 10 tribes that are going to ally themselves with a king, and that's going to be the king of Israel. But then Jerusalem and Judah, they are going to be the southern kingdom, and so that will henceforth be called Judah. That is where later we're going to get the word Jews from. It's actually from Judah. All right. I'm sorry?
I couldn't hear either. It's Judah and what?
Jerusalem. Basically the capital, Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the capital then of Judah. Judah will become a nation.
Yeah, we said another city too. Judah.
I mentioned another city?
I thought so. Judah and Jerusalem.
Yeah, Jerusalem. And I said, that's where we get the word Jew from the word Judah. Yeah? So, well...
Judah, right?
Yeah. We're going to talk about another capital, another city in the north in just a moment. We will see, eventually we'll see Samaria becoming the capital of the nation Israel. But we'll only see that later. That doesn't start out right up front, okay? So here we have Judah. In fact, probably Shechem was going to be first the capital in the north, and then later it will become Samaria. So again, I'll show you another map so you can again see the divisions, but now you see also the surrounding nations. Yeah. So here we have Judah, and here we have Israel. Now, what are the surrounding nations? Here we have the Philistines. Here we'll have the Edomites. You probably have heard Edomites before, or Moabites. All right, Ammonites. So those are all different nations. Those are the surrounding nations in the vicinity of Israel and Judah, the two nations now. Then we have Syria. In my Bible we use Aram, but I think in the NLT it will be just Syria, which is of course more familiar for us. With the capital of Damascus, which we know of, and Phoenicia. Phoenicia is important too, because when we start talking about Jezebel, well, Jezebel is the daughter of the king in Phoenicia. All right, so Phoenicia is also an important country that we have here on the map to understand what we are reading about. All right, so that is kind of like a map. Now it gets really complicated, but you don't have to see it, or you don't need to get everything, all right? Now let me show you a timeline. So this is the map, all right? Now I'm going to show you a timeline, what's going on, all right? And so here we see, and I know it's too small for you probably to see it on the PowerPoint, but we have the United Kingdom here, and then we begin with the divided kingdom. And right, 1Kings chapter 12, we begin with seeing the kingdom divided. That is at the end of the reign of Solomon. So under the United Kingdom, we have Saul, David, Solomon. Henceforth, the kingdom splits, and we have the northern kingdom that is called Israel, the southern kingdom that's called Judah. And henceforth, it will continue like that. And then we will see that because of their sins, because of their idolatry and so forth, eventually what we read in Deuteronomy will come to pass. And that is, God says, if you disobey, if you don't do all those things, I will punish you and I will send you into exile. And so in 722 BC, Israel, the northern kingdom, will end up into exile in the empire of Assyria. So remember we talked about empires before? We expected Solomon to be the first empire, then it would be a godly empire with a righteous rule, because God is still king even though we have a monarchy, but that never happened. Even though he had everything going for him, with all the wealth and wisdom and power, military might, he could have been an empire. It never became. And instead, we have a terrible, horrible empire by the name of Assyria, and those people were sent as slaves. The whole nation is wiped out. Everybody sent into exile. Samaria would be destroyed. The southern kingdom will last 200 years longer. And so henceforth from here, that is where it gets confusing also, and that is when Israel no longer exists in the north, then sometimes again Judah is also called Israel in our Bible. But actually we are referring henceforth always to the southern kingdom. And they will go into exile in 586 BC because of sin. And so then in 586 BC, Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, all the Jews, like 99% of them, are banished, are exiled to Babylon, which is a different empire than Assyria. So that's the big picture overview. Yeah, and so when you who is reading the book of Kings? We talked a little bit about it. Just remember, we always need to remember the stories happened a long time ago from the perspective of who was reading it the first time.
They are the people that are returning to...
Close. They are in exile or returning from exile. Very good. But at least what you're observing is they are the people in Babylon. All right, so that's very good. All right, so we are now here. We believe Jeremiah wrote the book, And Jeremiah wrote to the book, he wrote, basically the people that end up getting to read it would be the people that are in exile. All right, good. So, what happens after Solomon? All right, we have Solomon's son on the throne. He will be the first king, therefore, after Solomon. We don't have a divided kingdom yet, but everything is set up for the kingdom to be divided, because what does King Rehoboam do? He asks for advice of how he should be ruling, and so what does he get? The elders are telling him, if you serve them, they will serve you. But then he also asks his peers, what do you think I should do? And they basically say, make the burden heavier. Tax them even higher, all right? So I guess the elders were Republicans. They say, don't tax them higher. And maybe the young men were the Democrats, all right? Tax some more, okay. All right? But unfortunately, he listens to the young man, and of course, the main problem is also where Chronicles stresses, and that is, he never asked the Lord.
Right.
And so, whereas at least Solomon did, and Solomon, most of his reign was righteous and was good. He did evil. Why? For he did not set his heart to seek the Lord. And so as a consequence, the kingdom is going to be divided. God even sent a prophet to Jeroboam, which was a servant in the palace of Solomon, who serves Solomon, yeah. And he was a good, diligent servant. But then a prophet went up to him, and this prophet was wearing new garments, and then this prophet tore his garments into 10 pieces, and then he gave him 10 pieces and said, you will get 10 of the tribes. God is going to give you rulership over 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's the story with Jeroboam.
Of who? Jeroboam.
It's right there on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
So again, it's very confusing because the previous name was Rehoboam, and now we are talking with Jeroboam. So those are two different characters, all right? So we will see that Jeroboam will become the king of Israel, which is the northern kingdom. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon that will continue to rule in Jerusalem, therefore he will be the king of Judah. Yeah? So what does King Jeroboam do? Interestingly, also Jeroboam is promised a prophet went to speak to Jeroboam and said, if you do what is right, you will be having a son on the throne forever. Yeah. So actually something similar was promised to Jeroboam, but he did not at all listen to it. Because one of the things that he was afraid of is he was afraid that when the people go back to Jerusalem to worship, because there are 3 main festivals that they always have to go back to the temple to worship, that he will not have control over his own people. All right? He will not have control over his own people, that they will be influenced and that they will undermine his rule. And so in order to control them, what he did is he built up 2 shrines, and he makes the people in Israel now worship golden calves at those shrines, so that they no longer have to go to Jerusalem. All right, so there is a city in the south, the name is Bethel, which is not too far from Jerusalem, and then there is a city in the north, far north, and that city is Dan, all right, and set up the worship of the golden calf. And right now, I think you guys, we have had Mark Smith here, right? So Mark Smith he can tell you more about, we have been excavating the shrine of, I think, the one in Dan. So the one in the north is actually excavated. So we have historical evidence also that we can see of the setting up of the golden calves at the shrine that Jeroboam did. Now, so what is his terrible sin? Well, of course, and again, talking about politics, okay, political expediency, and that is the use of short-term effective methods based on practical rather than moral considerations. I probably looked it up in a dictionary. That's a long time ago. I don't even remember where I got it from, but I would not have come up with this myself. I know that. All right. So it is moral. Political expediency. All right. And again, something political, and that is sometimes we as Christians, it will be very difficult as Christians to actually serve in Washington, in some kind of a governor capacity or president or so forth. Why is that hard? It's because so easily it will be so strong, the temptation would be there to compromise, all right, for expediences purposes, so that we can get something done, all right. But of course, we need to be careful not to make moral compromises. And that is, of course, clearly the case with Jeroboam when he says, go and worship these idols. And the irony is that he would actually basically quote what Aaron said back when they were coming out of Egypt. What did Aaron do, the brother of Moses? He said, here is the golden calf. This is Yahweh that has taken you out of Egypt. This is the God that has taken you out of Egypt. And so it's like Jeroboam did the same thing, the same sin. And in fact, it is word for word quoted. So he actually knows what happened. He knows what happened to Aaron and to the people, and that the Levites came and slaughtered a lot of people because of their idolatry, thousands of people. He knows the history of Israel. You know that because he quotes Aaron word for word, and he still does it. Yes. He still does it because he wants to be king. He wants to be in control, and so he wants to manipulate everything and make sure that rather than trusting God that said, if you obey me, I'm going to give you a dynasty that will be eternal. I will give you will be on the throne. You will have peace. Your son will be on the throne. Just trust me. Instead, Jeroboam trusts himself and his own schemes and plans, and therefore with bad results. All right? So, having talked a little bit about Jeroboam, what we're going to see when you read all of the book of Kings, you will see many times the word Jeroboam repeated. And that is because henceforth, when we study the kings, we're going to find out to what standard do the kings live up to. And there are now two standards already introduced. And that is the standard of David, which we of course have done in previous weeks, talking about David, and the standard of Jeroboam. And so basically, Jeremiah, that I believe is the author of the book, Jeremiah is a prophet, and he is much more interested in the religious conditions of the land and the moral state of the land, and so also that of the king, than all the other things that are all important too, like whether there is peace in the land, whether there are buildings being constructed, when there is prosperity, or whether there is a famine or not. That is also important. But as a prophet, what is the condition of the king compared to? And so each time when you come to an end of a passage, and so the king dies, and then it often says something along these two lines. Okay? For example, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and followed the sins of Jeroboam. So that is being said about many kings. If the king happens to be a good king, which unfortunately doesn't happen very often, then it says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and according to all what David his father has done. And his father, not meaning Solomon, but like grandfather or great-grandfather. Basically, he did okay. Now, again, when we go back to the two kingdoms, we have the northern kingdom. They have about 20 kings, and then they go into exile. And none of those 20 are going to be said this. They will every single king is being marked as he did evil, like that of Jeroboam. He followed the sins of Jeroboam. And so basically what the author is doing is he's weighing, he's weighing how did the kings do? And then of course primarily, how did they do spiritually? All right? Okay, you can be a good king and even reign a long time and even actually have being an economic powerhouse. And sometimes Jeremiah doesn't spend much time on him because there was nothing spiritually happening in the land. All right, so that was the primary concern of the author, which is then Jeremiah. All right, so those are the two standards that we are henceforth having to keep in mind of. You can see the repetition, and so you know that is what one of the themes in the book, an agenda that the author is having, trying to figure out, okay, their standards. Do they live up to the standard of David, or do they go down so far and live according to Jeroboam? All right, again, as you can see, we have to skip a lot of chapters all the time because it is only an overview that we're doing in these 52 weeks. And so now we are coming to what happens as a result of this division too, and that is there is civil war. So now also brother is fighting against brother. All right, they're both descendants of Abraham, but the people in the north will make war with the people in the south, and vice versa. And the first one right away starts for 30 years. And it even says the war began between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. That's the two first kings, the first king of Israel, the first king of Judah. Continued all the days of his life. That is referring to one of the two kings. But then in the next one I read, a couple verses later, there was war between Asa, that is King Asa, and King Baasha of Israel. All their days. So in other words, that civil war continued. Even after a king died, it just continued. And so we see a lot of this happening in those couple hundred years. They are not only fighting with neighboring nations such as Aram and Moab and the king of Baasha and so forth, but they also fight with each other. So I call it civil war. Although technically, maybe civil war is not a correct term because it actually is becoming two different, it has become two different nations, two different political entities with two political capitals. All right? So war between the brothers. So imagine having just come out of the golden age during the reign of Solomon, and now this is what's happening. War. Atrocities that are committed, fighting, hatred, all right? People are being displaced, you have refugees. That is the atmosphere.
What's going on right now?
Yeah, exactly what we read today too. But of course, not necessarily in Hawaii, okay? But it's happening in other areas and other places in the world. Yeah, but even on a global scale, there is a lot of this happening right now. And of course, I believe the bottom line is, why is that happening? Because we are not following the Lord.
Right.
All right, and we are not living by a standard that God has given us. We prefer, as I said, political expediency and moral compromise. All right, so that's not what we want to do. Good. So again, that is about those two kings. Let's see what else we have. Okay, so we have, let's talk about King Asa, I should say, A-S-A, if I can find it in my notes.
Chapter 15.
Yeah, chapter 15, very good. Yeah, King Asa, he will be the first good king. He will be the first good king. So this is not really this picture. Let me just mute this for a second. And the first good king since David. Yeah. And King Asa, it starts out like this. If you read with me chapter 15, verse 11, it says, Asa did what was right in the spirit of the Lord, as his father has done. Can you see it? Compared with David. All right, and so we see that with all the kings. When they are a good king, it says he was a good king as his father David. All right, so now he was good. What did he put away? It says, for example, in verses 9, it says, no, not in verse 9. In verse 12, it says, he puts away the male temple prostitute. So already that has happened. Ever since the downfall after Solomon, you'll see pagan temples. Well, Solomon built the pagan temples. and now we see male prostitutes and so forth, and he got rid of them. Okay, he put away the male prostitutes. He also rid of the nation of the false gods. Okay, got rid of all the foreign gods, which means that they all were built up. All right, thanks to Solomon and also Solomon's son Rehoboam. All right, he tore down the pagan altars, the pillars and sacred poles. Those are all terms related to their Canaanite worship. He removed. The problem here is only that he mentions that in Kings it doesn't say that he removes the high places. High places are like every little hill will have a little shrine with an idol in it that people in that particular village worship. A Baal, a version of Baal. And so he didn't remove all of them. Now many of the kings, even some of the good kings, didn't do that. Part of it is probably because it was a difficult task, because you would have hundreds and hundreds of them throughout the land. Every hill would have one or something. All right. So, but it does say he became powerful militarily, and it says that he fortified his cities. That means that he had the time and the money to build up the walls of all the cities. So he was actually again, he was going towards reaching again that political height, religious height of the reign of Solomon. But then, so there was even like a little bit of a revival, all right? And so in Chronicles you'll read that the people again renewed their covenant with God, all right? If you want to write it down, it's 2 Chronicles chapter 15, all right? 2 Chronicles chapter 15. So he defeated Egypt, it says in Chronicles, okay? And so he made, as I said, all the reform. He led the people back to covenant relationship with God. All right. And after having defeated Egypt, he got worried about Israel, the kingdom in the north. Remember, we are dealing with a king in Judah. All right. But he got worried about the king in the north. And so he made an alliance with Syria. Okay. So here we are. Let me just show you the map. He is king in Judah. He is, after having defeated mighty Egypt, but he didn't have the trust and faith that he now also will be able to withstand any pressure or invasion from Israel, and therefore he makes an alliance with Syria to make sure that Israel will not become a powerhouse, to make sure that Israel will not invade, or if they do, then they will be defeated. Now again, that is one of the things that the kings, when we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, requirements of the king, one of the things the kings are not supposed to do is making military alliances. Because they're supposed to continue to trust God and not put that trust in military alliances, trust other kings. And so that became a problem. And then later, and because of that, because he made this alliance, the Lord struck Asa in his feet, and he had a disease in his foot. All right, he has a disease in his foot. And then, and there is like one, even though he was a good king, he was compared with David, there was still an unfortunate ending. And it's kind of like revival happens in the land, but how do we maintain revival? That's the key. And we see every revival is followed with something bad happening. And in the case of King Asa, it says that because he made a political alliance and the Lord struck him with a sickness, it says even in sickness he did not seek the Lord, but he would only seek the help of doctors, and therefore he would die with this disease in his feet. That is what the Bible says. That is Jeremiah's interpretation of what happened in that era of time, politically, militarily, but more importantly, religiously. And that is, he did not stay faithful to God all the way till the end. He did not have trust in God at the end. Even, it says, Jeremiah stresses, even in his sickness, he would refuses, so that the stubbornly resisting, it's kind of like, it has happened in the past that I lost something in the house, where is this? Where is this? And I get really frustrated and angry. And Lisha would say, why don't you just pray? Maybe the Lord will show you. And I refuse because I'm so angry. All right, so here, even in his anger, and I should not do that, of course, it's pride. And it is the king, probably it has gone to his head. Okay, he had become very proudful because he was a mighty king, a successful king. I defeated the Egyptians, which is an incredible feat. But it got to his head. And so, a sad ending for King Asa. All right, now let's go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, we are here, but now we are, when you look at this big picture overview of the kings, all right, you have to look with me, otherwise you can't follow, because it's hard to follow as it is. Okay, and I didn't think I should have made a mention of this on the PowerPoint. But do you see that I have the Omri dynasty right there in the middle? Do you see that? The Omri dynasty. So, why do I call this Omri dynasty? Why do we have dynasties? Well, because another thing that happens in the south is there is what happens more in the south and that happens in the north, in the northern kingdom, more so than even in the southern kingdom, and that is, besides having civil wars and political unrest and sometimes infighting, what happens in the north is also you have overthrows of governments. So you'll have, and so every time when you have a new dynasty, that means that a new family overthrows the existing royal family. What they usually do is they'll kill everybody so that there's never going to be a future threat to the throne, and then that means you have the beginning of a new dynasty. Yeah. So we have several dynasties. I think 5 different. I could be wrong, but I think it's 5 different dynasties that will pass the scene in a matter of like 200 years. So there is a lot of bloodshed in the north. Everybody fighting for the throne, and slitting of throats and assassinations taking place, so that a new family establishes themselves as a new dynasty with one of their members of the family becoming a king, and then of course the son of that king, and then the son of that one, and so forth. Yeah. So evidently, the author considers the Omri dynasty very important, and that's why you have that more or less in the middle of his book. Remember, 1st and 2nd Kings is originally one book. Now, and so you see then, if you go from the Omri dynasty to the left and to the right, I have a similar phrase, and that is the kings of Judah and Israel. It's talking about the kings of Judah and Israel. See that on the left and the right? In the left you see that the north splits up from the south. Do you see that right here? The north splits up from the south. Here you will see that the north is being exiled. Yeah. So what I'm doing here is showing you what we call a structure. And there are many Hebrew, in the Hebrew text especially, there are many literary structures, and it goes like this, that A is, we don't have good markers, do we? And that is, we have A that is like in the center of a story. You see, we like to put the most important at the end of a story in the Western world. If we read a detective romance or something, then the outcome of everything is towards the end. We are going towards a climax in the last chapter of a book. But that's not how a Hebrew mind works, and that's why often we don't get it, what we are reading in the Bible. Because often is something that the author, which is Jeremiah, and he is interested about the political condition of a land, is in the center of a book, which I now identified as the Omri dynasty. Yeah, and then you see that there is something similar over here, and that is B and B with an apostrophe right there, and that is, he's talking about the kings of Judah and Israel. He talks about the kings of Judah and Israel. And then you have C, he says about the north split up, and now the north is exiled. Yeah, and then you even have Solomon's reign, and then the remaining years with only Judah. All right. And
I'm sort of lost with what babies and stuff.
Okay. Okay. Look over here again. Look over here.
Okay.
Okay. The Omri dynasty. Mm-hmm. A.
Okay.
Yeah. Look left and right.
I see
of the Omri dynasty.
A, B's, and C's over here listed on this sheet. I think that's where I'm getting confused at.
Okay, do you see Omri dynasty?
I do.
Left and right?
Yeah, so the Omri
Kings of
dynasty in
Judah.
the middle is A.
Yeah. Yeah, you can draw A in there, right there.
Okay.
And then you see B is which were the kings of Israel and Judah. Left and right of A.
B.
Yeah, and then B with a, you call it apostrophe?
Okay.
Yeah, and then you have C, which is something that happens with the north. The north split off from Judah, and as punishment at the end you see that they're exiled.
And that's D.
And then D would be, what I forgot what I said, Solomon. Basically you will have the kings of Judah, but then of course, well, I wrote down Jerusalem's rise, and then he said Jerusalem's demise.
So that's both D.
D, yes, yes. So there is like a mirror, left and right. Yeah. In literary form, we call that a chiasm. Yeah. So you can even look up the English word in a dictionary and find out what it means. It's a structure. It's an intention, an author's intention of writing something down. Okay. Like they have a pattern. They have a plan. Whereas in English we go A, B, C, D, and then we work towards D being the climax. We go D, C, B, A, B, C, D, like that. Yeah? All right. Imagine if you're doing you're in a political concert, and not a political, you're at a concert and you listen to classical music, and say by Mozart or something, and it's like during that 1 hour of performance, actually it reaches a climax in the center. And then, but then it doesn't suddenly abruptly stop. It continues and it eases off for another 20 minutes. You understand what I'm saying? So you have this and this. All right? So, we'll talk more about that because there are many. In fact, every psalm has this. Every single psalm, 150 of them is structured like this.
That's going to make it way
No wonder.
easier to look at, and because
What?
I think about
That-
like you were saying, if we read a murder mystery or something,
Right.
and everything's at the end.
Yeah.
So it would be like, you get some clues, you find out the solution, and then then it kind of backtracks a little
Yeah.
bit and tells you how they got the clues
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah. 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 Very good. Yeah.
Crime
And-
investigation.
Yeah.
There's a climax and then.
And then it's still easing off, yeah. But the problem sometimes is we don't get enough out of Psalms, and part of it is because we don't have a Hebrew mind. And remember, we read it in English. And so a lot of this gets lost. And so when you know this, and then you know what to look for, I have a thick book by a professor. He wrote down all 150 of them that I could not see, perhaps, I could not see them myself, was it not I look at this book, because he knows his Hebrew. He's also a very famous author that I could not invite here because he would be too expensive. That kind of a famous person. His name is Templar something, I forgot. But when we get to Psalms, I'll mention that for sure. All right? So when you look at the Omri dynasty, all right, and then again, even in there, you see a little bit of a climax that I see, a chiasm that I wrote down. Remember that structure that I see? And you see that with a civil war at the beginning and at the end of that Omri dynasty. Do you see that?
Yes.
On the horizontal, on this big picture overview. And then you see the life of Elijah and the life of Elijah. Don, there are two different prophets. He's not paying attention anymore. Don. Two different prophets. Elijah and Elijah.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, right.
And then we also see I wrote down E with an arrow with an E. You see that? Okay, that is the change of political power. The prophet gave his cape to the next prophet, and then the ministry continues with the new. Yeah. All right. So that's kind of like how I play with this big picture and how I try to sort it out. When
The prophet gave his what?
I'm sorry.
Cape.
Yeah, like Elijah gives the cape to Elijah, and then he gets a double anointing and so forth, and then Elijah in the chariot is taking off to heaven. All right? Good. And then the gray areas that you have these dots, or how you call that is just to show you that this is a king in the north and this is a king in the south. You see that? So it mentions over there Israel's kings and Judah's kings. You see that? Over there I mentioned Israel kings and Judah's kings right there.
So during the Omri dynasty, are all of Israel's kings then from the Omri tribe, or that family? All in that family?
Yeah, he had about 4 or 5 sons on the rule, on the throne. So they all fit right there. The story is then right there. The story is more or less in chronological order. Yeah, so then you see an overthrow of a dynasty, and then we begin with a new dynasty. Yeah?
So Israel is south and Judah is north.
Judah is south, Israel is north.
Oh, okay.
Yeah? Backwards. So.
Yeah.
So most of the time Judah is doing a little bit better than Israel in the Judah doing a little bit. Judah in the south is doing a little bit better than Israel in the north. Good. Now,
Well, when you say better, it's just
A little bit.
They lasted about 200 years more.
better, and there were a few kings that are,
Better kings.
yeah, of them is said he did like his father David did.
Yes.
So we don't have that a lot, but we have King Asa already, we mentioned.
Right.
We discussed King Asa. Later we'll have King Jehoshaphat,
Yes.
who is going to be a good king. King Hezekiah, who's going to be a good king.
Yes.
King Josiah, who's going to be a good king.
Yeah.
All right, so we have 4. Did I forget one? 4 or 5? I think maybe just 4. All right, good. So let's talk about this King Omri. King Omri, he establishes the Omri dynasty. That means he overthrew the previous dynasty, killed everybody off, set himself up on the throne. And when you look and he reigned for 55 years, 52 or 55 years, I forgot, but he reigned for a long time, and yet he spends, Jeremiah only spends a few verses on him, because really, spiritually, there is not much to say other than it was just all bad. Yeah? But this is what happens. And we know, we have found this, a Moabite stone, and this is the king of Moab that writes this, and so it has been translated. So we have again archaeological evidence of this King Omri. He really existed, because outside of Israel, outside of it, we have found archaeological evidence. And what does this Moabite king wrote on a monument that we have found? Omri, king of Israel, he oppressed Moab many days because Chemosh was angry with his land. That means because of this Moabite god, his name is Chemosh, was angry with the Moabs, and therefore they were oppressed by this king of Israel. And so he must have been a powerful king. 55 years he ruled, and he also established Samaria as capital. So he actually, for the first time, we see Samaria coming up, being a political capital of the northern kingdom.
We don't see Chemosh mentioned biblically.
That's correct.
There's nothing that we.
I don't know. You have to look it up. Chemosh is a god. Is the name of a god. So we do have many gods named in the Bible. I can't recall now if Chemosh is actually mentioned. But so it's not a name of a king. It's
in the name of a live person.
No, it was a god. They worshipped a god by the name of Chemosh. Okay. And this king says, "Oh, we were oppressed by this king of Israel because our God was angry with us." All right. And so, but the only reason I bring it up is because this King Omri, his name has been found in the field of archaeology. Yeah? Good. So, now, whereas King Omri was not so important to Jeremiah to write about, King Ahab became extremely important. That is the son of King Omri. And when you go to chapter 16, verse 31, and it says, "And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam," remember, that's the standard, he was an evil king, according to the sins of Jeroboam, What else did he do? He married Jezebel, daughter of King Asbel. Asbel means being with Baal. Asbael means being with Baal, so he's like with this pagan god of the Sidonians. By the way, he is also the king of Asbael, is both a high priest in the temple, and he is also a political on the throne. So he has a lot of influence in Phoenicia. So it says Sidonians. I don't know what the NLT says, but basically we're talking about Phoenicia. Sidon is a city in Phoenicia. Now earlier I showed you the map. If I can go back really fast, that is right here, Phoenicia. Yeah? And that is where this Jezebel is coming from. You don't want to call your daughter Jezebel. All right? You probably don't even see it very often because there is some bad history about this. Yeah? So, Ahab marries the daughter of the king of Phoenicia. All right, this Jezebel, and so that was again a political alliance that was forbidden. I mean, Solomon did it also, right? The first thing we read in 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1 is that he made a political alliance with Egypt. Chapter 3 verse 1. So that was also bad, but for the rest he did pretty good. Solomon did. But here, why is this so important? Is because it was through Jezebel. You see, when you read the story about Ahab, you will notice that actually King Ahab is a wimp. For example, one time he was upset because he wanted a vineyard.
Yeah.
And so Jezebel arranged for it, by killing the owner, and so here's your vineyard. So, how you say that in English? Jezebel was the pants in the house. Do you say it that way? He was the muscle. Whereas King Ahab was a wimpy, Jezebel was the strong person in the house. In fact, it is Jezebel that tries to wipe out all remaining worship of Yahweh in the northern kingdom. Everything. And she was trying to replace it with the worship of Baal. All right. Can you now see that that is why Jeremiah decides to spend more attention to the story because of this, what is going on in the land politically, spiritually. And then, what else do we read is that God raises up a mighty prophet, and his name is Elijah. And so Elijah is called to prophesy and minister to the northern kingdom. Not southern, the northern kingdom. The majority of the prophets, written prophets, because Elijah never wrote a book. So we don't have like the book of Elijah in, we have a movie like that, but we don't have a book like that, okay? The book of Elijah in our Bible, all right? And, but he was a major prophet. I mean, he is quoted more than any of the other prophets in the Old Testament. Remember, even Malachi at the end of the Old Testament will say that God will raise up another Elijah, which turns out to be John the Baptist. All right? And Jesus quotes Elijah. In fact, when we see the transfiguration, and Jesus is on the mountain, and we see at the transfiguration, what does Peter see? He sees Jesus, and he sees Moses and Elijah. Okay, the law and the prophets. And then suddenly the law and the prophets are gone, and it's just Jesus that he sees at the transfiguration. So Elijah becomes a major character in our Bible, and for us in the New Testament as well. All right, so this is a pivotal point in the history of Israel. That is why we have that climax, the A. Okay, we reach a pivotal point in the history. And so Jeremiah is talking a lot about it. And there is a battle going on. There is a battle going on between the people that are following Yahweh and the people that are following Baal. Remember, Jezebel represents Baal worship. So here we get this clash happening in the middle of the book of Kings. And that is, we see at one point, and it probably is a story that you have familiar with, where Elijah is challenging the 450 priests of Baal. And so basically, what Jezebel, it is a battle between Jezebel and Elijah, the queen of Israel and Elijah. And he says, okay, the God that answers with fire, it truly is God. Do you remember that story? So we are at Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is, in the Jews would call it the garden, like the Garden of Eden. It must have been very beautiful. The Phoenicians, the people that, you remember, Jezebel is a daughter from Phoenicia, from the king of Phoenicia. The Phoenician calls it the dwelling, that is where Baal lives. That is his home. So basically Elijah is going to Baal's home turf and says, okay, let's have a contest. And let's have a sacrifice, but we are not setting the sacrifice on fire. We let God do that. So you go ahead and call out for Baal and have Baal strike this sacrifice with lightning. And of course nothing happens. And so for hours what you see is that the priests are doing all kinds of rituals and worship and crying out to the gods and so forth. They are beating themselves with, up to the point that they are whipping themselves, up to the point that they begin to bleed and so forth. And so, and even in the story you will see that Elijah makes fun of them, saying, maybe you should be louder because your gods are asleep. Maybe he went on a journey, all right? He also says, maybe he wandered away, and people say, actually that's a euphemism, but he actually is saying maybe he went to the toilet. All right, and so Elijah is making fun of these 450 prophets that are trying to call fire from heaven, from Baal. Remember, at this particular time there was 3 years of droughts, and Baal is the king that brings rain to the land. And so already the fact that there is famine and that there is a drought for 3 years tells you something about this Baal that is not very powerful. And then of course, Elijah comes in and says, okay, just soak this place with so much water, okay, drench it all, make it totally wet, and he calls out to God, and boom, lightning came from heaven and consumed everything. All right, and then we see that basically that was a breakthrough. That was like people there was like a big audience. There were a lot of people watching there. I mean, really, when you are standing at that place in Mount Carmel, for miles away, people can hear you. It's just like a valley and so forth, where the sound goes very far. So you need to imagine there was like a big audience watching this happening right there. And so because of what happened, they turned against the Baal priests. They killed all of them, all 450 of them. King Ahab was there, but he survived, and he got to go away. And so King Ahab ran away and went to be with Jezebel again. All right, you would think, why didn't he get saved after a miracle like that? Anyway, then we will close with that because we got only 5 more minutes. The story finishes. The story that we want to finish today with the story of Elijah. And that is, when you continue to read the following chapter, so we see Elijah's victory, but then we also see in the next chapter Elijah's struggles. All right? And now we try to bring some application into our own lives, because don't we often, sometimes we call it, like pastors call it Blue Monday, and that is after having a spiritual height on Sunday, having prepared for a message, having delivered a message, maybe even having done an altar call, people having gotten saved and so forth. It's kind of like you reach a spiritual climax, but then Monday can be very depressing when you're suddenly all by yourself. And so we call that, not we, because I'm not a pastor, but pastors call that like a Blue Monday. And here we see that a little bit with Elijah, because he celebrated, he had this victory, and everything was glorious and sunshine, and the next day you say that he was totally depressed. And he reached even a place, he said, I will just take my life away. He wants to die. All right? And so he was discouraged. Why was he discouraged? Even though he had such a victory. Okay? Well, because the people are very fickle. And though they were suddenly realized, oh, Yahweh is the true king, the true God. And so they killed all the Baal priests. But the truth of the matter is, they are very fickle, and there was no real revival coming into the land. There was no real change, even though he had such a great victory, having defeated the 450 priests of Baal. All right, and so he had this great victory, but then it did not follow through with revival. So maybe Elijah was disappointed because his expectations were not met. And that sometimes happens in our lives as well. Okay? In chapter 19, verse 4, it says, "Enough, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Now, I don't think that is humility when he says, "I'm no better than my ancestors." I think it's frustration. It is discouragement that he expresses himself that way. All right? Because instead of revival, he had to flee. Why? Because the queen of Jezebel was coming after him to have him killed. And so he had to go into hiding. All right? So the fact that a revival didn't happen was a huge letdown for Elijah. All right? But you know, when you look at Elijah's life, I mean, he prayed that there would be no rain, and there was no rain. He prayed that there would be rain, and there was rain. He controlled the weather. Ha, that's pretty good. He defeated 450 Baal priests. That's pretty good. All right. He at one point was fed by ravens, birds bringing him food.
Unclean birds.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah. He raised somebody from the dead.
Yeah.
We've read. If you guys have done your reading, I hope you did.
Yes.
He multiplied food and oil for the widow.
Yeah.
All right. He had everything going for him. He was much like Peter walking on water, except when Peter looked down, he started to sink. And so Elijah also lost focus and forgot for a moment where he lived by. He was supposed to live by faith. And faith means you look up to God. And so he sat down on under that tree and says, "I have had it." All right. He wanted to die. All right. He was prone to mood swings. All right. Every victory that we are experiencing in life will be challenged by our spiritual enemy. All right. In this case, Elijah had a mental breakdown. Okay. So we can learn from him, from his life. What happened after that? And God actually reaches out to him. Whereas earlier we read that ravens would feed him. Now we see that the angel of the Lord would come and feed Elijah. It's like God himself would feed him to get his attention. All right? And so God saw Elijah's pain and disappointment and showed compassion. It says that in 19 verse 6, a cake was baked. So he was given some cake, and he got some rest too. He fell asleep, okay? Just a little bit of food and a little bit of rest can do miracles in our lives too when we are having a mental breakdown or are depressed, all right? He was basically touched by an angel, all right? I'm not referring to the TV series, but he was touched by an angel. Because it says in verse 5, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." And so God was really ministering to him, all right? And then after that, for 40 days, without eating, he went on a journey. So there must have been quite a power bar that he got. All right? Because for 40 days, he would be able to go without food. And where did he go? He went back to Mount Sinai. He went back perhaps the very spot where Moses got the 10 Commandments. And Elijah would be in a cave. And remember, so Elijah was whining and complaining all along up to that moment in time. He continued, even after being fed by God himself, having this power bar, he was whining and complaining because he was so discouraged. He says, "I've been zealous for the Lord, and I'm the only prophet left in the nation." I mean, when I die, you're left with a non-profit organization. All right? It's not my joke, okay? I stole that from somebody else. You may have heard it before. All right? But so that is what all happens. But then how does God answer? And I'll wrap it up this way so that we don't want to miss the service. But it starts only in 15 minutes. But,
What are you doing here?
huh?
He says, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, what are you doing here? That is what God is speaking. Okay, what are you doing here? Now, I'm not saying, why are you here right now? He is very much in the place where God wanted him to be, in Mount Sinai. God told him to go here. So when God said that, it says, he was more referring to, what are you doing here? What is your heart? Why is your heart where it is right now? Why are you so downcast? Why are you so depressed? That is what basically God is saying. He was not addressing a geographical location. God had him at the very place where he wanted him to be. And then God started to speak. But before God started to speak, we get the whole point. And so in chapter 19, verses 11 and 12, okay, I read for you. Go out, God says, and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Chapter 19, verse 11. Verse 12. Oh, still verse 11, sorry. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not there in the wind. You see that? Mm-hmm. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And like what happened with Moses, happens here with Elijah, and that is God comes by, and Moses has to hide in a cave. So in verse